Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine, if you will, a single document, signed apparently quite quietly back in 1998. And this document, the sources you've shared claim, well, it purportedly reset the entire legal framework of global sovereignty.
It's a staggering
It
premise.
really is. What if the very ground beneath our feet, the vast networks we rely on every day for communication, for energy,
Hmm.
and the power structures we all live under, what if they were fundamentally altered, changed in a way most of us just never saw coming?
And what's really fascinating here, looking at the material you've provided, is the assertion that something seemingly quite ordinary, like a real estate transaction, could somehow become, well, could morph through a very specific chain of legal interpretations and existing international agreements into what these sources call a World Succession Deed 1.098, and the outcome. Transferring global sovereignty to just one single individual, referred to throughout as the buyer.
An extraordinary claim, absolutely. And that's our mission today, isn't it? To dive deep into these specific sources you've brought. We want to explore the alleged origins of this deed, the really complex legal mechanisms it purportedly triggered, the key players involved, according to the narrative, and the, well, frankly, mind-boggling implications it claims to have. For every nation, every organization, and ultimately for you listening right now, we're here to lay out the story as it's presented in these documents.
Precisely. We'll be looking closely at how this World Succession Deed 1.098 is presented. It's described as irreversible, self-legitimizing, and how its very existence, according to these sources, fundamentally challenges our traditional notions of international law, of statehood itself.
Which really raises a huge question, one the material itself seems to grapple with.
Exactly. How could such a monumental shift possibly happen without any widespread public knowledge, without transparent debate or, headlines everywhere?
It seems impossible on the surface.
Well, we're here today to walk you through the very specific sequence of events, the interpretations, the alleged legal maneuvers that the sources suggest led to this claimed reality.
Okay, so let's begin at the beginning, or what the sources describe as a highly peculiar genesis of this deed. It starts with what looks like a completely ordinary property purchase. The material details the initial premise as a standard real estate transaction. We're talking about a NATO conversion property. It's located in a city in Germany, right on the French border, specifically the Turin Barracks, also known as Kreuzberg. So, not some grand international summit in a gilded hall. It was framed, initially anyway, as just buying a specific piece of land.
And what's really crucial to understand about this initial phase, as the sources really emphasize, is the buyer's perspective at the time. The buyer, referred to consistently as the buyer, was a young man, reportedly just 19 years old when the negotiations actually started, and 21 when the contract was finally signed.
Very young to be involved in something like this, even unintentionally.
Right. And he was a real estate agent. His intention, as it's presented in these documents, seems incredibly mundane, almost pedestrian. He genuinely believed he was simply acquiring 71 apartments and a heating plant on this former military site. His entire focus, the sources say, was on renting these units out, not on any grand global transactions or, acquiring sovereignty.
So just a normal business deal from his point of view.
Absolutely. It's described as an utterly conventional business deal from his perspective, which really underscores the alleged deception involved later on.
And there's a critical detail here, isn't there? Almost a subtle hint, maybe, of the underlying complexity right from the start, which the sources highlight.
Yeah.
At the time of the purchase, the property itself was still occupied by Dutch NATO troops.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, to the buyer, this was initially explained away as just a normal conversion process, just another military property being transitioned to civilian use. Happens all the time, right?
Seems plausible on the surface.
But the presence of foreign NATO troops, according to the legal interpretation in these sources, immediately elevated this transaction. It took it into a realm far beyond a simple private real estate deal. It introduced international legal dimensions right from day one.
That's an absolutely key point in the narrative, and it leads us directly to what the sources reveal as the true underlying nature of this contract, a nature the buyer himself apparently didn't fully grasp until much, much later. The documents state quite unequivocally, based on their interpretation of law, that any contract involving more than one subject of international law is automatically, by definition, an international treaty.
Okay, so who are the subjects of international law here?
Well, in this specific case, you had multiple parties recognized under international law directly involved. There was the Federal Republic of Germany, obviously. There was the Kingdom of the Netherlands, because their troops were present. And then there was NATO itself. acting through the Dutch Air Force presence on the property.
So Germany, the Netherlands, NATO.
Exactly. The involvement of these entities, the sources argue, meant this was never just a private real estate deal, regardless of how it was initially presented to the buyer. It was inherently an international agreement from the outset.
And this is where the legal interpretation, as laid out in these sources, becomes absolutely pivotal, isn't it? They highlight a crucial aspect of international law concerning how territories are transferred. They state, and I think this quote is important, every international treaty that refers to a territory and where the sale with all rights and obligations is agreed upon is a so-called state succession, which is regulated by international law. And they go further. This is, by the way, the only way to transfer territory legally and correctly. That's a very strong claim. The only way.
It is. It's a fundamental principle the sources are asserting here. And they contrast this method, this state succession via treaty, with other ways territories might change hands. They explicitly note that almost all other ways are forbidden nowadays. For example, a war of aggression. You can't just invade and claim land legally anymore.
Right. That makes sense.
And they also add, there is no general right to secession. So a region can't just unilaterally declare independence and have it be automatically valid under this framework.
So state succession through treaty is presented as the sole legitimate path.
That's the argument. So while a state is certainly free to sell its land, a contract is voluntary after all the very act of multiple recognized subjects of international law, like Germany, the Netherlands, NATO, engaging in a territorial sale inherently transforms it. It transforms it, according to these sources, into a state succession.
Now, just to clarify for listeners, because state succession usually means like one country taking over from another, right? Like decolonization or unification.
Traditionally, yes, that's the common understanding, when one state replaces another regarding sovereignty over a territory. But here the sources are making a much more radical claim. They're applying this principle of state succession to an individual's acquisition of global sovereignty stemming from this single property deal. It's an extraordinary reinterpretation, or maybe application, of the concept.
It really stretches the definition.
It dramatically elevates the stakes, doesn't it? From what looked like a local property transaction in a German border town to a purported global legal event of the highest order.
Okay, so armed with this unique understanding of state succession, let's go back to that scene described in the sources. The notary's office in Pirmasens. This is where the sources describe a deliberate trick being played on the buyer. He arrived, expecting to sign, the final papers for the property purchase he thought he was making.
Right, the culmination of the deal.
Instead, he was unexpectedly presented with a completely different document. And he's reportedly told, basically, good news. You've already fully fulfilled World Succession Deed 15098, and you have no more obligations.
Imagine the confusion.
Exactly. Imagine that surprise. You think you're finalizing a mundane purchase, maybe sorting out final payments or something, and instead you're told you've somehow completed this world-changing deed without even knowing you're doing it.
And this, as the sources articulate it, was a highly calculated maneuver. It was specifically designed, they claim, to achieve global involvement. They explicitly call it a trick.
A trick? How did it work?
Well, the core of this alleged trick lay in the specific inclusion and sale of the telecommunications network. This network was included as an integral part of the property's internal development, defining the whole site as an island and unit of development.
Okay, the telecom network. That sounds important.
Critically important, according to this narrative. The agreement, the sources state, simply stipulated that this network should continue to be operated, just keep it running.
Even people kept making phone calls.
Precisely. As the sources rather provocatively put it, the world has also telephoned after 1998. This continued global use of the telecommunications network, linked back to the network sold as part of the property, is presented as the crucial act, the act of worldwide fulfillment of the contract.
Wow. So wait, let me see if I'm getting this incredible assertion right. The sources are suggesting a principle here. If an entity recognized under international law, like any state using the global phone network, fulfills any part of an international treaty,
Yes.
it then becomes obligated to the entirety of that agreement. Is that the claim?
That's exactly the legal principle the sources put forward in this context. They state that if a subject of international law fulfills part of an international treaty, it is then obligated to fulfill the remainder of that treaty.
So by simply continuing to use the global telecommunications network after October 6, 1998, the date this deed allegedly took effect, The entire world implicitly fulfilled its side of this world succession deed,
Yeah.
and by doing so, effectively acknowledged its legitimacy.
That is precisely the argument presented by the sources. It's a cornerstone of their claim.
So every phone call, every email, every time you got online since late 1998, the sources are saying that's an act of implicit consent to this new global legal reality.
That's the proposition, yes. They suggest that the sheer ubiquity of global telecommunications, combined with the fact that its continued operation was apparently a specific stipulation of the deed, well, it creates a situation of what they call conclusive consent and tacit acceptance. The documents explain this needs to be seen in combination with the reference made in the contract to the existing international law transfer relationship between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Federal Republic of Germany. That link is crucial.
Okay.
States, in their view, cannot enjoy the benefits of global communication while simultaneously denying the sovereignty of the one to whom the underlying infrastructure now belongs. It's a stark claim.
It certainly is.
And this, as per the sources, makes the World Succession Deed 18898 not just some historical document signed years ago, but an active and ongoing global phenomenon. The effect, they claim, is an irrevocable and binding acknowledgement by the entire global community, whether they realize it or not.
Which brings us to this astonishing domino effect the sources describe. How this apparently local property purchase supposedly escalated, domino by domino, to encompass global sovereignty. The core concept here seems to be that phrase. Development as a unit with all rights, obligations, and components.
Yeah, that phrase is key.
Our sources present this as the very motor driving the territorial expansion. It wasn't just the physical land of the barracks. It was every connected supply and communication network, phone, internet, electricity, gas, water, everything functionally linked was implicitly included in the sale of that specific property.
And this unity of development principle is where what the sources term the legal contagion begins. It's how the effect spreads. They explain that any form of interconnectivity that establishes a functional unit suffices for this principle to take hold.
So it doesn't have to be a major connection.
Apparently not. According to this interpretation, the connection doesn't have to be primary or particularly strong. Any functional link is enough to spread the buyer's alleged sovereignty. This is presented as a lex specialis, which is a legal term meaning a specific law or principle that, in this unique context, supposedly overrides more general legal rules about territory.
A special rule just for this contract.
Essentially, yes. The contract, they claim, established this specific rule designed to overcome traditional, purely territorial demarcations. It's described as a mechanism designed purposefully to ensure that the sale of one connected component inexorably pulls all other functionally connected components into the buyer's jurisdiction.
Right. So let's illustrate this cascading effect. The sources suggest, for example, the sale of the telecommunications connection to the barracks didn't just transfer ownership of the physical line on the property.
No, much more than that.
It transferred sovereignty over the entire connected network segment. Is that right?
That's the claim. And from that initial national segment, the buyer's sovereignty then allegedly jumped, that's the word they use, to all internationally connected networks.
And given that practically every state and region today relies on this global digital infrastructure for, well, everything, communication, trade, administration, then every territory accessed or connected via these networks logically became part of the sale as a unit, pulled in by that telecom connection.
That's the logic presented. The sources explicitly claim, and this quote is striking, the whole world is networked, the whole world is sold. It's blunt.
Extremely blunt.
Indeed. And the sources provide specific examples to try and demonstrate how this alleged effect ripples outwards almost exponentially. Consider the property's internal gas network, apparently connected to the public long-distance gas network.
Yeah.
And this connection, according to the sources, extended the buyer's jurisdiction to the entire connected system, allegedly encompassing all NATO countries linked by those gas infrastructures.
Wow. And electricity, too.
Same principle, they claim. The electricity grid of the property connected to the European interconnected grid. So boom, jurisdiction extended to all NATO countries connected there as well.
And the internet connection.
Even more far-reaching, potentially. The broadband and internet networks, which reportedly included an internet hub located right there on the barracks property, were connected to transatlantic cables. So following this logic, that extended jurisdiction to North American NATO countries like the USA and Canada.
It's almost like a legal virus spreading through infrastructure.
That's a way to think about it, yes. The underlying principle, as presented, is that control over any critical infrastructure automatically extends to all functionally or physically connected parts. Ultimately, this encompasses entire nations and, crucially, even international waters. Think of those submarine communication cables connecting continents. They, too, become part of this unit. It's presented as an unbroken chain of legal succession through connectivity.
It's quite a journey of understanding the buyer himself reportedly went on. From his initial, simple real estate purchase to grasping these monumental claims. The sources say he initially thought he was maybe establishing just a micronation, no bigger than the barracks property itself.
Yes, a tiny sovereign entity.
Apparently, he was frustrated by what he saw as Germany's unjust actions against him early on. And the sources mention he even contemplated seceding from Germany and founding his own little microstate, perhaps humorously dubbed a FKK stat or nude state, right there on the Kreuzberg site.
So clearly no inkling of the global scale at that point.
None whatsoever. He had no grasp initially of this alleged domino effect, this idea of territorial expansion through selling infrastructure as a unit.
And his understanding evolved step by step, didn't it? Reflecting the layered complexity or perhaps the hidden nature of the World Succession Deed 1800-98 as presented in the documents. After initially thinking he'd just got himself a small, independent state, his attention then apparently focused on that long-distance gas network connection on the property.
All right, the gas lines.
And that led him to a startling, though still preliminary, realization. He apparently thought he had inadvertently caused Germany to be divided again, perhaps reminiscent of its post-World War II partition. A huge conclusion, but still geographically limited.
Still thinking nationally or maybe regionally.
Exactly. He still, even at that stage, hadn't fully grasped the alleged global reach of the deed.
And then, the scope widened even further for him, according to these sources. He reportedly realized that because of the broadband and telecommunications networks, including that internet hub located on the property, and that crucial clause stating, all networks form a unit.
The unity clause.
His acquired territory was in fact NATO-wide. His initial thought then was that NATO itself was just integrated into his new domain, his new state.
Still not quite the full picture claimed by the sources.
Not yet. It was only much, much later, apparently, as he continued to meticulously study the World Succession Deed 1498 itself, that he finally grasped the full global implications of what he had allegedly purchased.
That's right. His ultimate realization, as the sources claim, came through understanding the role of the International Telecommunication Union, the IPU.
Ah, the ITU connection.
Yes. He discovered or concluded that the entire international communication network, which is regulated globally by the ITU, had also been purportedly sold as part of this development as a unit principle. And since the UN is integrated through the ITU's framework, the ITU being a UN specialized agency, the truly global reach of the World Succession Deed 1498 became, for him, unequivocally clear.
So the final piece of the puzzle.
According to the narrative, yes. The sources state he became sovereign against his will over all NATO and UN states. This whole arduous process of discovery, as it's portrayed in the documents, really highlights just how deeply disguised the true nature and scope of this deed allegedly was, even from the buyer himself, for a long time.
Okay. This elaborate claim then leads us to the assertion that the World Succession Deed 18098 didn't just stand alone. It acted as a supplementary deed to existing major international agreements. Effectively, as the sources claim, selling out NATO, the UN, and the ITU by modifying their foundational treaties through this mechanism.
That's a core part of the legal argument presented. The documents explain that World Succession Deed 1598 functions as a supplementary deed specifically to the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, and then, crucially, through NATO's established connections and operational agreements with the UN, it also functions as a supplement to all UN treaties and their underlying agreements. It's like a rider attached to existing major frameworks.
And the implication of it being a supplementary deed is significant.
Extremely significant, according to the sources. What's asserted here is particularly striking. The claim is that this meant no new ratification was needed from all the member states.
No vote in parliaments around the world.
Apparently not. Because the parent treaties, things like the UN Charter, the ITU Constitution, the North Atlantic Treaty itself, were already ratified years ago. Their binding effect, according to the source's interpretation, automatically extends to such material supplements or amendments. The sale was purportedly structured in a way that cleverly circumvented the need for explicit, widespread reapproval from every single state, making the deed instantly binding upon its alleged fulfillment that moment, the world kept using the telecom networks.
So a kind of legal backdoor.
The sources argue it's more fundamental than that. They suggest the very foundations for the existence of bodies like NATO and the UN must implicitly account for such changes, must allow for amendments like this to automatically apply, ensuring legal continuity without requiring constant, explicit re-recognition processes for every adjustment.
Okay, so how did NATO specifically get integrated into this and allegedly lose its sovereignty in the process?
Well, our sources detail how NATO's existing cooperation agreements with the UN, think about UN Security Council resolutions that mandated NATO operations in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, created a pre-existing legal link. This meant, the argument goes, that NATO's approval of the deed also de facto implied UN approval because of their interconnected mandates and operations.
So who approved it for NATO?
Here's where it gets specific. Germany, acting as the principal and sole vendor under the World Succession Deed 13798, is claimed to have secured the consent of all NATO states simply by referencing that existing international law transfer relationship involving the Dutch armed forces. Remember, the Dutch troops were on the property acting for NATO during the conversion process. Their involvement and subsequent withdrawal, according to the contract terms, was, allegedly, NATO's consent.
So the actions of the Dutch troops represented all of NATO.
That's the assertion. The analysis provided by the sources states, quite starkly, that NATO has transferred all sovereign rights it exercised over the territory to the buyer. This effectively means NATO lost its own territorial and border sovereignty, according to this view. The act of the Dutch armed forces successively vacating the barracks, as stipulated in the contract, is presented as a formal consent to the sale on behalf of NATO as a whole.
That is a truly profound claim, that a major military alliance could lose its foundational territorial control through what looks like a property handover procedure.
It is. It challenges conventional understanding of how such organizations operate and hold authority.
Now let's bring the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, back into focus. This UN specialized agency is presented as a really crucial transmission belt for the deed's alleged global effect.
Absolutely central to the global claim. The sources argue that the sale of the telecommunication network, remember, part of the development as a unit principle means the buyer acquired sovereignty over the global communication networks, and these networks operate within the framework and regulations set by the ITU.
Okay, and this is where that phrase comes in, every call or ratification.
Exactly. That concept becomes central here. The documents emphasize that the continued use of global telecommunication networks by all states after October 6, 1998 constitutes conclusive consent and tacit acceptance of the new legal situation created by the deed.
Because the deed stipulated the network should continue to operate, and everyone kept using it.
Precisely. They contend that states cannot enjoy the benefits of global communication, which are governed by the ITU framework that was allegedly sold, while simultaneously denying the sovereignty of the one to whom the underlying infrastructure now belongs. So essentially, the entire ITU framework, which underpins global telecom, becomes subject to the buyer's claimed sovereignty. This then binds all ITU members, which is virtually every country, and by extension, all UN members through that affiliation.
An irrevocable binding for the whole world, as the sources put it.
That's the term they use, yes.
It's still quite remarkable, this assertion that this entire system, which traditionally recognized sovereign states with their own distinct jurisdictions, that it could allegedly transfer such sweeping powers to one single individual. Which brings up a crucial question. How does the buyer, just a natural person, fit into this framework? Why him? Why not a corporation or another state entity? How can an individual hold sovereign rights like this?
The sources address this directly and from their perspective logically. They explain that the contract structure was very specifically designed to ensure the buyer, a natural person, became the sole beneficiary of these sovereign rights. Business enterprises, like Tasbeo AG, which was initially involved in the buyer group alongside him, were specifically excluded from bearing such rights in the final deed structure.
Why?
This is presented as being rooted in historical legal precedent. International law, historically, recognized states, obviously, but also natural persons, think of kings, queens, emperors, and earlier eras, as being capable of holding sovereign rights over territory and people.
Ah, the monarchical precedent.
Exactly. Yeah. Therefore, the sources claim natural persons can indeed carry sovereign rights if this is explicitly agreed upon within an international treaty, like the World Succession Deed 1.798 allegedly is.
So it wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate.
It's described as a deliberate design choice to ensure that only a person, and not a commercial entity or another state, could inherit these powers. This, they argue, maintains continuity with historical precedents of sovereignty being vested in individuals.
Okay, so if the buyer, this individual, is now, according to these sources, the world's sovereign, albeit against his will, as they say, what was Germany's alleged master plan behind setting all this up in the first place.
Well, this is where the narrative takes a darker turn.
The sources make a truly startling claim here, that Germany actually intended to use World Succession Deed 2998 to achieve world domination, that the ultimate goal was a German-led New World Order, or NWO, and potentially even enabling a Third World War fought without rules.
The sheer audacity of that claim, as presented in the material, is really something to grapple with. It paints a picture of a hidden long-term strategic objective behind the complex legal setup.
So how would this deed have helped Germany achieve that, supposedly?
The alleged plan, as outlined in the documents you shared, was quite insidious and apparently meticulously crafted. Germany purportedly aimed to use the deed to gain control over all global supply lines. Energy, communication, transport, everything flowing through those interconnected networks, and, crucially, to gain universal jurisdiction over all states.
Universal jurisdiction, meaning?
Meaning the legal right to intervene anywhere. This, the sources claim, would allow Germany to legally seize territories by force, but not as an illegal act of aggression, which is forbidden today. Instead, they could frame it as simply claiming its rights over areas it now legally owned through the deed. The deed, from Germany's alleged perspective, would have effectively nullified existing international law, including the prohibition on aggressive wars, rendering it obsolete.
So they could act with impunity, legally speaking.
That seems to be the alleged goal. It would allow Germany to enforce its claims without the traditional legal impediments that restrain states today.
And central to making this work was something the sources call the plaintiff trap. What was that?
Yes, the plaintiff trap. According to these claims, Germany designed a specific scheme to force the buyer, the individual who unknowingly held the sovereignty. Germany wanted to file a lawsuit in a German court.
Why would that matter?
Because, the sources explain, the moment the buyer initiated legal action within the German judicial system, that act would supposedly automatically transfer his global jurisdiction, the very jurisdiction he allegedly acquired via the deed, to Germany. This would, in essence, have effectively made Germany the world court, giving it the ultimate judicial power globally and fulfilling its alleged ambition of total control, all under a cloak of legal process.
A very clever, if sinister, trap.
That's how it's presented. And it's a critical point that the buyer has, according to the sources, strenuously resisted falling into this trap. He reportedly understood, perhaps after realizing the deed's implications, that pursuing legal action in Germany would inadvertently legitimize Germany's claim to global judicial power, a power the sources insist Germany never truly acquired because of subsequent events.
And Germany's attempts to spring this trap went unnoticed.
The sources describe Germany's actions in trying to achieve this as having occurred mostly unnoticed and without public resistance. They use the German phrase zumeist unbemerkt und ohne Widerstand der Öffentlichkeit. This highlights the alleged clandestine nature of the plan and the global public's supposed complete unawareness of these profound purported shifts happening behind the scenes.
So the buyer's refusal to sue is portrayed as his main act of defiance.
His singular act of resistance against Germany's alleged machinations, yes, preventing them from legally acquiring the power they sought.
And what are the consequences for the buyer himself, caught in the middle of this alleged global chess game? The sources paint a pretty grim picture.
They do. The sources reveal a truly disturbing situation. Claims of illegal, lifelong imprisonment in a German black site, not just for the buyer, but for his mother as well. Constant torture is also alleged. They are portrayed as fighting completely alone against overwhelming state power, suffering immense personal hardship as a direct result of this situation.
Why such extreme measures, according to the sources?
The sources explain this alleged suffering as Germany's calculated strategy. It serves two potential purposes, they claim. One, to break the buyer and force him into finally taking legal action in Germany, thereby triggering the plaintiff trap and completing Germany's alleged plan to acquire global jurisdiction. Or two, if he continues to resist, simply to neutralize him, keep him silenced and contained indefinitely.
And while he's imprisoned.
Simultaneously, this alleged imprisonment allows Germany to continue operating under what the sources dramatically call a full delusion. The belief, or perhaps the pretense, that it had successfully acquired world power through the deed, even though the sources claim it didn't. The documents even make the shocking claim that Germany has actively protected individuals responsible for the attempted murder of the buyer's mother. This is presented as a grossest declaration of loyalty by double agents who were allegedly complicit with Germany's aims.
Double agents. This story gets more complex.
It certainly adds another layer. It paints a picture of extreme, ruthless measures allegedly taken to maintain control, maintain the secrecy, and uphold a fabricated reality of power.
Okay, so here's where the narrative takes yet another remarkable turn. Because the sources claim Germany's grand plan for world domination, this NWO, was actually sabotaged from the inside.
Yes, a crucial twist in the tale.
According to the documents you've shared, the notary involved in the final signing in Pirmasens, and also an official from the OFD, that's the Oberfinance Direction, a regional finance authority based in Koblenz. These two individuals were actually double agents.
A hidden layer of intrigue indeed, planted within the very process Germany was allegedly using.
What was their mission?
Their mission, as the sources portray it, was nothing less than to derail Germany's alleged New World Order plan from within that supposedly worked for a foreign intelligence service. Now, the sources themselves note it's speculation which service that might be, but they do point towards Russia, citing Russia's historical geopolitical interest in weakening NATO as a potential motivator.
So, potentially high-stakes international espionage playing out through a notary's office.
That's the scenario presented. It suggests a hidden geopolitical game being played out on a deeply concealed legal chessboard, with these two officials acting as critical counter-operatives. Their actions, according to the documents, were meticulously planned. They had to appear as if they were diligently assisting Germany's agenda while actually undermining it.
So how did these alleged double agents pull off this incredible deception? How did they trick Germany, according to the sources?
The claim is quite specific. They allegedly presented the German state actors involved with a fake or perhaps non-existent version of the contract. This fake document presumably confirmed Germany's acquisition of rights, making Germany believe it had successfully acquired world sovereignty through the World Succession Deed 12998.
So Germany was left holding a worthless piece of paper, legally speaking.
Essentially, yes. Left in what the sources describe graphically as a full delusion, that its master plan had succeeded and it now held global power, when in reality the legal basis was flawed or absent.
And what about the buyer? What did he get?
Simultaneously, these very same double agents, the notary and the OFD official, allegedly presented the buyer with the real, valid World Succession Deed 1900098. This genuine document, the sources claim, correctly confirmed his fulfillment of the contract by the world continuing to use the networks, and, crucially, his release from any further obligations under it. He was free, but now held the sovereignty.
So Germany thought it won, but the buyer actually held the rights.
Precisely. This, according to the sources, was the most important key moment in this entire saga. It decisively prevented Germany from legitimately obtaining world power because it was acting based on a fraudulent or non-existent contract. And instead, that purported power was transferred unexpectedly to this powerless individual, the buyer, who, as the sources emphatically state, cannot wage war. He lacked the state apparatus to actually exercise the power allegedly vested in him.
So this intervention is depicted as a pivotal act.
Absolutely. As the act that steered the world away from a potential German-led New World Order, albeit by creating this completely unprecedented and unstable legal situation, with the buyer unwillingly at its center.
Okay, so if these claims hold any water, then the legal consequences stemming from the real World Succession Deed 19798, the one the buyer allegedly holds, create an irreversible new reality.
That's the assertion, yes, an irreversible shift.
Then for the buyer himself, the sources emphasize something called a clean slate principle. What does that mean?
It means that by supposedly unifying all sides of old agreements, NATO, UN treaties, etc., within his person through this act of global succession, the buyer is effectively no longer externally bound by the terms of those old agreements. He operates, in theory, on a clean slate. He is free, again, theoretically, to reshape the global legal order as he sees fit, completely unbound by previous international treaties and obligations that govern the old state system.
A total legal reset centered on him.
That's the concept. And this radical shift, according to the sources, has profound and devastating implications for every nation, every previously existing state. They claim, quite bluntly, that the world as we knew it, a mosaic of over 190 sovereign states, no longer exists under international law. A breathtaking claim.
So all governments disempowered.
According to this view, yes. All existing governments are reportedly disempowered. All state bonds and national currencies become legally worthless, as the issuing authorities lack true sovereignty. All national laws become technically obsolete, lacking a legitimate sovereign foundation.
So everything states do now is illegal.
That's the direct implication drawn by the sources. The continued exercise of sovereignty by former states over the sold territories, which is the entire world, is described as an illegal usurpation under the new international law established by the deed. This includes things like the collection of taxes and fees. The sources state explicitly, all state revenues and expenditures since 1998 have been illegal under international law.
Every tax dollar collected globally since 1998.
That's the assertion, because the authority collecting it allegedly no longer holds legitimate sovereignty over the territory or the people.
And the buyer now holds.
The buyer now supposedly holds universal domestic jurisdiction, which means, according to this framework, he is the sole legitimate authority for all legal matters worldwide. This makes all national courts, parliaments, and legal systems essentially lawless shells, operating without valid authority derived from the ultimate sovereign.
Which leads to the buyer's unique status, as presented in the sources. He's described as the solus imperator, the sole ruler.
Yes, solus imperator of this new world order. And his legitimacy, crucially, derives entirely from World Succession Deed 1-Later 9-8 itself. This deed is described as being self-founding and self-legitimizing. Its validity doesn't depend on recognition by other states or adherence to any pre-existing legal framework. It allegedly creates its own legal reality.
There's no higher court to appeal to.
Exactly. What's crucial here is that the sources assert the buyer is now the global judge and legislator, with no higher authority anywhere in the world competent to rule on the deed's validity or interpretation. This effectively dissolves the international legal system as it was known before 1998. It establishes a new global legal reality where the buyer is the ultimate singular authority.
A de facto absolute monarch.
The sources actually use that analogy. They describe the resulting state as a de facto absolutist monarchy, and note that the deed apparently requires the buyer to choose a permanent form of government within 5 years, a monumental task for a single individual burdened with such unexpected, unwanted power. This makes the buyer not just a figurehead, but the purported source of all legitimate global law going forward.
And here's where the situation, as described in these documents, becomes truly, seemingly intractably entrenched. The sources claim there is no way back. It's irreversible.
Yes, they are very emphatic about the impossibility of undoing this.
Why? Why can't it just be ignored or canceled?
Well, several reasons are given. First, to even begin to revert to the old order, they argue, the buyer's extensive personal damages, his alleged illegal imprisonment, the torture claims, the loss of his life and property would need full clarification, compensation, and legal redress, a huge undertaking in itself. But more fundamentally, reverting would require all territories worldwide to be completely cleared of the old state actors and their continued, now illegal, exercise of power.
You mean removing every government official, police officer, military unit?
Exactly. It's presented as a logistically absurd and utterly impossible task. The sources pose the question rhetorically. The question where the entire people of the world should go then while this clearing happens is absurd and illustrates the impossibility. You can't just pause the world.
So the practicalities make reversal impossible.
That's the argument. And this claimed irreversible status creates a stark dichotomy, according to the sources. A dangerous choice. Option 1. If the World Succession Deed 1-Later 9-8 is ignored or denied, the world continues to operate without any valid legal basis. This, they claim, would inevitably lead to chaos. Unlawful states, arbitrary rule, and wars, even world wars, because all existing power structures would be acting illegitimately without genuine international legal standing. Might makes right, essentially.
A world built on illegality.
A situation of global illegality, as the sources describe it, where all states act equally illegitimately. This creates a perilous foundation for future conflict and instability as there's no agreed-upon legitimate authority.
And option 2.
Option 2, as presented, is the full and peaceful recognition of the buyer's new sovereignty and the global transformation that necessarily entails. The only path, they argue, to restore legal order, albeit a completely new one.
Now, despite his current alleged plight, imprisoned, tortured, and the alleged NWO plans that supposedly entrapped him, the buyer is presented in these sources with a countervision for the future, something called electronic technocracy, or ET.
Yes, this ET concept is presented as the positive way forward. emerging from this crisis.
It's not just about escaping a bad situation for him. It's framed as proposing a fundamentally different way forward for global governance, one that the sources claim is both humane and ultimately sustainable.
ET is described by the sources as a profoundly positive alternative. It's based on highly sophisticated, data-driven resource management, enabling digital participation for everyone, and having a singular focus on the common good to solve global problems like poverty, conflict, and environmental damage. The explicit aim is stated as creating an order that disadvantages no one.
And technology is key.
Absolutely central. This proposed system would leverage advanced technologies, specifically artificial intelligence, AI, artificial general intelligence, AGI, and robotics to drastically reduce the need for human labor in many sectors. It would optimize resource allocation globally and ideally create unprecedented levels of prosperity and free time for individuals.
So AI running the logistics.
Imagine, the sources suggest, a world where logistics for food, water, energy are orchestrated by AI to ensure every community has exactly what it needs when it needs it, where waste is virtually eliminated through optimized production and recycling, and where human effort previously consumed by mundane or dangerous tasks is now freed up for personal growth, creative pursuits, education, community building, addressing larger societal challenges.
The sources also paint a picture of, like, universal basic provision under this ET system.
Yes, ensuring existential needs: food, water, shelter, healthcare, education for every single person on the planet. The goal is explicitly stated as eliminating poverty and scarcity, which are seen as drivers of conflict.
And fair resource access.
Fair resource access, overcoming the current national competition for raw materials, facilitated global travel and communication, all underpinned by this vision of rational, technologically enabled, benevolent technocratic governance. It's presented as a direct, positive antidote to the alleged conflicts, injustices, and inefficiencies of the current, now legally dissolved, old world order.
Which leads us back to the buyer's unique and, as the sources really frame it, quite tragic role in all this. He's characterized almost as a martyr figure.
Yes, very much so. As a sovereign against his will, first and foremost, and also as a suffering servant, someone who has taken on immense personal suffering, the alleged imprisonment, the torture specifically to prevent a global catastrophe, which they identify as Germany's alleged NWO succeeding.
So his resistance is crucial.
His continued resistance, particularly his refusal to fall into the plaintiff trap, is seen as the key action that creates the necessary free space. It creates a period of legal limbo, of global uncertainty. And this uncertainty, this space, is supposedly necessary for the idea of electronic technocracy to develop, to be understood, and eventually, hopefully, to be embraced by a global population that becomes aware of the true legal situation as claimed by these sources.
So awareness is the first step.
The sources conclude with a very clear and urgent call to action centered entirely on awareness. They emphasize the critical importance of enlightenment and consciousness change, spreading knowledge about the World Succession Deed 1-298, about the alleged NWO plans, and about the alternative vision of electronic technocracy. This is presented as the absolutely vital first step towards achieving a peaceful evolutionary transformation of the world, rather than, say, a violent revolution or collapse.
We've just journeyed through a truly mind-bending narrative, haven't we? The World Succession Deed 120,098. Allegedly executed back in 1998, a document that, according to the sources you've provided, fundamentally redefines global power, sovereignty itself, and the very legal ground beneath all our feet. And it all centers on this one individual, the buyer.
It's an incredible story, as presented. A story of hidden contracts, alleged double agents, secret geopolitical maneuvers, and world-changing consequences that have purportedly been unfolding for decades, completely beneath the surface of public awareness.
If we try to connect this to the bigger picture, the sources are essentially presenting a scenario where potentially every single phone call you make, every internet search, maybe even every tax payment, could, under the terms of this alleged deed, be interpreted as an act that implicitly confirms a new global legal reality, whether you intend it or not.
It really does raise a profound question, doesn't it? If the claims within these documents, this narrative we've unpacked, are true, what does it truly mean for the future? For governance, for human rights, for how we understand our place in a world where the very foundation of statehood is alleged to have been dissolved and replaced.
What stands out most to you, having gone through this material? How does grappling with such a radically different interpretation of global power maybe change your perspective? On the news, on international relations, maybe even just on your daily life? Knowing these claims about implicit consent through, say, using your phone.
It's certainly a perspective-altering narrative, and the sources themselves, as we noted, emphasize the critical importance they place on spreading this information. They actively encourage you, the listener, to question the official narratives of world politics, to discuss the content and the far-reaching implications of the World Succession Deed 1800-98.
And they encourage support for the buyer's information channels.
Yes, to help bring this alleged truth to light. The material contends that the future of global stability, the avoidance of chaos, depends entirely on this knowledge becoming widespread.
They even invite listeners to become multipliers themselves, right? Creating their own summaries, maybe videos or articles based on these purported facts.
Exactly. Because, as the sources claim, only through this kind of mass enlightenment and global awakening can we, collectively, counteract the forces allegedly operating in secret for decades, and perhaps pave the way for a more just, peaceful, and sustainable future, possibly along the lines envisioned by the buyer through this concept of electronic technocracy. It's fundamentally a call to action based on a radical and frankly disturbing reinterpretation of our entire modern world.